CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy. After 2 years and more than 80 episodes of our Conversations on African Philanthropy, we are introducing a series of conversations that are theme-specific, program-focused, and at times recorded at the request of those at the coalface of implementation in order to document and tell their experiences and stories. In the first of such series, we focus on the Zimbabwe Alliance Initiative, whose grants, convenings, capacity building, and technical support have fostered a vibrant civil society, where partners were empowered to design innovative and coordinated responses that amplify the voices of those marginalized, influence the capacity of citizens to mobilize around national critical issues, engage with policymakers, and built regional and international solidarity in pursuit of a better Zimbabwe. Formed in 2010 to strengthen the role of civil society in influencing Zimbabwe's transition to democracy, the Alliance has evolved over several phases to what it is today. An initiative of several partners, Zimbabwe Alliance is a story of resilience, innovation, dedication, and passion expressed somewhat beautifully in some of the least expected places and ways.
Welcome to a special episode on our Conversations on African Philanthropy with me, Beginkos Moyo. I'm the director of the Center on African Philanthropy and Social Investment, based here at the Wits Business School. I'm really excited today to be doing this episode. This episode is special in a way because it does two things. One, it looks at an intervention of specific donors and funders on specific issues in a specific context. But at the same time, we're using the episode to learn more about one foundation and an individual that has been behind it. I'm excited to be joined by Cynthia Ryan, the first executive director of the Schooner Foundation, but now serving as a trustee of the foundation. Cynthia, welcome to the Conversations.
Thank you so much. I feel like I should call you Comrade Becky. That's how all like the Zimbabwe Alliance, right? It's Comrade Fatso, Comrade Briggs. So thank you for having me, Comrade Becky.
Thank you so much, Comrade Cynthia. So, as we were working here, we were talking about how long back you and I met, but also that it's been more than probably 10 years since we actually met again in person.
Yes.
And part of the reason why I'm excited is because I wanted us to revisit part of that journey where many years ago, I was at Trust Africa then, working with Trust Africa, with people like Akwasi and others. And then we were approached by Briggs Bomber, Comrade Briggs, who was then based in the US with Africa Action. And they wanted us to serve as a platform that would assist with a concept around intervening in the Zimbabwean context during the crisis then, but focusing more on strengthening civil society, supporting grassroots movements, among others. And I know that you and many others were part of that initial concept and idea. My understanding from Comrade Briggs is that this happened in an ad hoc manner, but 15 years down the line, we want to take stock of that. So I want to have this conversation with you on a number of fronts, but firstly to just start from the beginning. As one of the founding people who came up with the idea jointly with others, what are the early memories that we have of this concept of Zimbabwe Alliance?
Sure. So Kumi Naidoo, who's a South African activist, who probably a lot of your listeners know, was a very good friend. And I knew him through my role as executive director of the Schooner Foundation. So we had gotten to know each other as, comrades, but also funding some of his work. And he saw the situation in 2008 of what was happening in Zimbabwe. There was no bread on the shelves. People were, hungry. People were getting, human rights activists were getting killed. So he went with one of his stepsons and actually undercover and did quite a bit of filming. And he was so moved by what he saw that he went on a 21-day hunger strike, which takes a lot of commitment. He then passed, it was sort of like almost like a marathon, passing the baton kind of hunger strike to a woman named Nomboniso Gaza, I believe. And he was telling me about this, and I actually did seriously consider going on a hunger strike, but health reasons and other things, it just didn't seem to, and I wasn't sure the impact that would have. But what we did decide is that Nambonisa would come to the United States, finish her hunger strike, staying at my home in Washington, D.C., where I lived. And we would try to draw as much attention from the West to what was happening there. Because one of the big questions I had as a philanthropist and in the donor space is why wasn't more donor attention and resources going to what was happening in Zimbabwe? So she came, and I tried to think of places I could reach out that could host and convene some of the, sort of discussions with her about what was happening more broadly in Zimbabwe. And so that's how I met Briggs Bomba at Africa Action. And so, as soon as I met him, I realized what a dynamic individual he was. And obviously, having been in exile, he really, and being Zimbabwean, he himself had a very personal, obviously invested interest in what was happening. And so we had some events in DC, and then Briggs and I were on a train to New York to try to get more donors involved. And we just said, why don't we start something? It didn't have a name. We never kind of discussed how long it would be around. So the fact that the Zimbabwe Alliance is here 15 years later is just fabulous to me, really wonderful. And we thought, let's try to find other like-minded donors and see if we can make a difference and really focus on sort of democracy building and taking advantage of this moment where there was going to be sort of a transitional government, shared government, to make a difference. And so knowing we wanted to be very welcoming and open to everyone, that being said, it was actually quite hard to find other donors interested. But very quickly we reached out to the Wallace Global Fund. They jumped in, IDEX, and then very significant, I would say probably the most significant donor partner was Trust Africa. And I don't have to tell you about Trust Africa, because we really wanted an African-based donor organization to be part of what we were doing. And that was really the beginning of it.
Yeah. So obviously there are so many things that have happened since then, and we'll try and cover some of those that you probably still remember. But obviously some of the things now have pivoted to new ways of doing things. And that's one of the things that I want to talk about in terms of the initial objectives and where we are now. But back to the story on the train, for example. So you meet Briggs, and clearly, other than him being a comrade and a former student leader who was already involved in activism, I always wonder, what is it that usually strikes a donor to immediately realize that this is something that I should invest in? In this case, what is it that moved you as an individual to actually say, I'm actually willing to bring the Schooner Foundation, but not only that, I'm also going to approach other like-minded donors?
I think the urgency of the situation, the fact that you had individuals willing to starve themselves for 21 days, right, was pretty significant. That's telling you something. Kumi Naidoo is someone that I already had a well-established relationship with and really trusted his judgment. And then I think the fact that Briggs, one, had a very sophisticated way of looking at things, but he also, I think he and I shared values around, let's actually find ways to support people on the ground doing the work. And he explained to me that there were civil society organizations in Harare in particular. They were pretty much the only place civil society organizations were left functioning. I remember him telling me a story that it was about $9,000 at that time in 2009 for that organization to actually still function and barely function. Fax machines, this is dating us all, office space, and they were under such physical threat and the emotional toll it was taking on people that it almost just seemed immoral not to do something, to be honest with you. And then our foundation has always really tried to find places that other donors aren't working. One of the reasons we chose human rights as our main area of focus is, if you look at the philanthropic pie in the United States, less than 1% is given to human rights funding. Democracy building, peace and security. So it already gets a very small percentage, let alone when you look at it globally, Africa gets a fairly small percentage. And then for some reason, just Zimbabwe wasn't on the radar the way South Africa, Kenya, and other countries are. And then I thought it was kind of exciting to start something new and to see what we could do.
Yeah.
And we liked the idea of it being a collaboration. So Schooner Foundation absolutely could have done something directly. I, as an individual, hosted somebody, but I think as donors, we ask grantees a lot to collaborate. And I really was excited at the idea of how does a bunch of donors come together and actually practice collaboration as well, and try to create a space where large donors and small donors, so it didn't matter if you were coming in with $5,000, we happened to be coming in at $50,000 for 3 years, but everyone had an equal voice, whatever your amount was. And then we really felt strongly that we wanted to do more than just give financial support. We want to be seen as a partner in solidarity. We wanted to be able to create a voice about what was happening in Zimbabwe, and we thought if we had an organized structure, we could do that better. And we wanted to also maybe provide non-financial resources as well, so whatever was sort of needed by folks on the ground. And I will say by 2011, Briggs and I were actually in Zimbabwe seeing for ourselves, and I think that was also significant. And we wanted to create a way to reach marginalized communities within Zimbabwe that could have a big impact but aren't normally sort of the recipients of donor funding. So that would be young people. I remember Comrade Fatso, Sam Monroe came to Washington, D.C. for some of these events. The Mugamba Network and some of the Zambezi News. It was such a unique way to communicate with Zimbabweans that wasn't necessarily seen as political. I remember learning that you couldn't have large political gatherings in Zimbabwe, but you could have a concert. And so I remember Comrade Fatso sharing with me some of his lyrics that were very political, but it was such a clever way to have a political meeting via music. It was amazing. Women, we really want to try to find a way to reach women in a way that sort of, I think Wangari Maathai was a beautiful example, right, where women were planting trees, but while they were planting trees, they were talking about human rights and democracy. Artists, and then the real grassroots organizations, ones that weren't necessarily based in Harare, where you just don't get donors visiting and getting those sorts of resources. So to me, it was exciting to try to do things in a different way.
And because, like you said, and like I also alluded to, there's really not much written about the beginnings of this story. I'm also interested to see if there's anything that comes to mind, like significant moments, especially maybe some of the meetings that used to take place in the beginning. Do you remember any of those? What were the key issues that you guys were focusing on, up to the point where you now decide, actually, we have to go through an organized structure like Trust Africa? Of course, Trust Africa came in partly as a donor, but also as a vehicle to actually then re-granting to the Zimbabwean constituencies.
So I remember reaching out to Scott and Christy Wallace of the Wallace Global Fund, and I would definitely give them credit. They actually hosted the first convening of bringing in like-minded donors. So, if I try to remember the early days, I would say it was really mostly Wallace Global Fund, certainly within DC, myself and Briggs. But then it did create some momentum. I'm trying to think, IDEX, that's it. I can't remember what IDEX stands for, but they came in fairly early. And then, beyond the meetings, I think we also wanted to try to be very responsive. So, I think our first grants went out in 2010, but we wanted to try to be as, I think, non-restrictive and responsive as possible, understanding that for a lot of these organizations on the ground, they were in such a difficult place that asking them to maybe go through the typical process that you might have a grantee was going to be really difficult. So I do remember those early conversations saying, let's try not to burden the whole sort of organization with a lot of, you have to do A to get to B to get to C. Let's just try to get as much into Zimbabwe as we can, and sort of almost build it as we do it. So let's just, gather together. Maybe we just make, a slight, a tent over ourselves, and then we'll build the house as we're in there. we didn't try to build the house and then move in. We sort of just planted a stake in the ground and started.
Yeah. And then, of course, like you said, part of what you were aiming to do is to just build this collaborative platform for donors where everyone has almost an equal voice, so to speak. And the same seems to have been the case with the composition of the partners in Zimbabwe. I remember back then, having partners that some of them were grassroots organizations, some were youth formations, some were artists, but you also had groups like your Crisis Coalition and others that were working on policy issues among those. So maybe one of the strands we could discuss here is, to what extent, as far as you remember, would you think that approach of trying to make sure that almost everyone has an equal voice and that the groups that are supported cover a wide spectrum, to what extent do you think that was successful or not? As far as you were in Zim, you said in 2013 or so. Do you have any thoughts around that?
So how successful we were in actually...
Yeah.
Okay. I think we were reasonably successful. I think you could probably always do more, right?
Yeah.
We did not get an enormous influx of resources. I wish I could remember the exact amounts we got, but it was in the tens and 20s of thousands, not the hundreds of thousands. But I also don't think it took significant amounts to actually make a difference. So one of the things I remember is, when we were looking at the different civil society organizations, we realized we could also come in and actually help them convene. I know we helped send a number of them to SADC after the elections. So there were ways we could help that I think had an enormous impact that weren't necessarily requiring a lot of money. And you absolutely needed the more sophisticated civil society organizations that were staffed by very sophisticated, educated people who really understood the opportunities to create the new constitutional, the constitutional reform that was required. And I think that's probably, to me, one of the lasting legacies of the Zimbabwe Alliance is that, we were directly responsible for getting individuals to the table who were able to draft, a constitution that, maybe it hasn't been able to kind of live up to everything that was in it, is a very strong document. And then in terms of, on the donor side, we realize collaboration is hard, and that it does require a lot more communication. You have to put your sort of egos aside. You have to sort of compromise. So, what one person thinks is the next best step might not be what someone else's does. And I remember we had a conversation, do we need to hire somebody and use some of our resources that could be going to an organization on the ground in Zimbabwe, or do we hire somebody who can help us coordinate in the US and help us additionally fundraise? And we did decide to do that. But there were some difficult conversations around that. Some people felt like we should each just sort of contribute what we can, but then it felt a bit chaotic. So we actually brought in somebody who helped us fundraise, but also just sort of organize how we were operating. And I do think that was money well spent.
And of course, part of that organization was actually the transition in the person of Briggs, from being one of the founding, I would say, thinkers of this idea with you and others, to him now actually being an implementer. And because he then came in through Trust Africa, implementing the Zimbabwe Alliance grants. But as you probably would know now, he's now the programs director of Trust Africa. And again, I think that's something, I don't know what we can draw out of that experience, because what Trust Africa did was to projectize the Zimbabwe Alliance, but also make it so central to Trust Africa's own grant-making strategy, to a point where Briggs, even though he was implementing the Zimbabwe Alliance grants, he was implementing them under Trust Africa. And therefore, at the end of the day, I think that provided cover as well, but it also gave them more access to other resources and other, I would say, partnerships that Trust Africa already had in place. And as we speak right now, I think on the ground, very few people might actually know the word Zimbabwe Alliance. They might actually just know Trust Africa is funding on the ground.
And it's very significant as well that Trust Africa really stepped up, and this was under the leadership of Kwasi Aidu, who again is an extraordinary Pan-African leader. And the Zimbabwe Alliance would not be what it was if he didn't see the value in it. So not only did they provide the mechanism to get the grants on the ground, but they matched what we raised, which is huge. And it was a real source of, I think, pride and significance that our major partner was an African-based organization. Because there weren't a lot at that time. In 2009, you didn't hear about African-based donors and donor foundations, that structure funding on the continent.
And of course, you mentioned one of the successful, I think, areas of this intervention was the constitution making process, and the fact that ZimAlliance, partners and individuals were actually part of the drafting. And we would be wrong if we didn't mention this year that one of the key drafters of that constitution is Alex Magaisa, who we recently lost, I think, last year. He used to be a law lecturer at Kent, and during that process, he actually was brought in as part of the Zimbabwe Alliance grants to work with Morgan Tsvangirai. He was actually his advisor and became one of the drafters of the constitution. So that's one of the stories that I think is also important to actually track. And so as I'm talking to other people, that's I want to pull out some of those nuggets in terms of some of the successful areas. So that's the constitution making side of things. There's the economic side of things, and I don't know if you remember anything from those those first few years, if you saw any movements as a result of our intervention.
Can you rephrase that question? I'm not totally
So there were grants, for example, that I think were given to groups that were working on economic governance. For example, I think there was ZimCode that was working on debt and other things. I'm just wondering if in your earlier, engagements, you remember any successful thing that could have come out of those economic related interventions.
Unfortunately, I don't. I'm sure they're there. I do remember, and I think it was a significant number of years later, maybe like 2013, 2014, Briggs working on the illicit diamond.
Yes.
And that's sort of, I think, probably, one that was tied into the economy that I can remember. But otherwise, no, unfortunately, I can't.
So the illicit financial outflows thing is actually one of their biggest, I think, interventions. In fact, it has moved on from just being a Zimbabwean issue to a continental campaign where they've now been doing Stop the Bleeding and all of that. So you are right, that's one of the things that was seeded by some of those interventions in the economic governance space. So the other thing that I wanted to talk to you about, Cynthia, is that in the beginning, obviously the objectives of the Alliance had to do with strengthening civil society, donor collaboration, making sure that even those in the margins are actually also strengthened, etc. But over time, there's been a shift of some sort in terms of the ZimAlliance. It has moved more to organizing. And as we speak right now, the greatest strength around the ZimAlliance is the social movements focus, which is the organizing around the barazas. I think they are going into their second or third baraza in November. I wanted us to talk a bit about that shift. As one of the people that was in the beginning with those initial objectives, what are your thoughts about this evolution of the ZimAlliance?
I think evolution is inevitable, and and the situation is so different. I think coming in and looking at constitutional reform, just creating an environment where you can promote free and fair elections, just convincing Zimbabweans that you could actually vote for an opposition party. I very clearly remember the atmosphere of fear there, and rightly so, when you saw so many, people who, even voiced that they might not vote for ZANU-PF, and the threats people felt. So, obviously as that environment changes and, the election results weren't what people wanted, but, over time, I think the Zimbabwe Alliance would have to evolve because the situation on the ground has changed. It's changed for the better, But the fact that Briggs Boma had to actually leave the country again just last month, and was physically threatened, and we possibly could have lost him, I think also shows you that sort of environment of fear is still, and threats, and the ability to voice, use your political voice in Zimbabwe is still very dangerous. So without question, I think an evolution to supporting more broadly civil society and social movements is really important, because it's still a country where that isn't a safe occupation.
I mean, and recently we are seeing lots of these protests by young people across the continent and beyond. And I think even though this initiative was strictly for Zimbabwe, you can actually draw lessons for what is happening right now in the continent. In fact, this baraza that I'm talking about is actually a continental baraza. So there are so many lessons that I think the initiative is helping us to draw for the continent. I wanted to check with you as we probably get closer to maybe pivoting to talking about Schooner Foundation. What are some of the key lessons that you are able to draw, firstly from the donor collaborative, especially if donors are thinking about something similar for countries like Zimbabwe and many others that could be considered as in transition? What are some of the key lessons that you could draw from? I think you started mentioning some of that earlier about how difficult it is to collaborate due to different interests. But I suspect there could be some lessons around that which you could pull out, but also the lessons for the continent, given the context in which we are around organizing and supporting some of these different movements, using the case of Zimbabwe.
Yeah, and I'll just say I've lived in Kenya now for the last 10 years. And as people probably have seen, it's made the New York Times, the Gen Z demonstrations and the young people demanding their rights in Kenya has been quite extraordinary to watch and be a part of. And, I think some of what we did as part of the Zimbabwe Alliance, lays the foundation for that. I think, supporting pro-democracy and social movements in one place affects everywhere. So, I think some of that groundwork and the ability for leaders like a Boniface Mwangi in Kenya come from seeing what we were able to do in Zimbabwe. So I would, I don't necessarily know there's a direct translation, but I think when people see those successes, so sort of lessons learned. I remember one example, something that didn't quite work is the NGO house. So, it was a very, I think, wonderful idea to create an actual physical space for, almost sort of like a shared workspace that's a lot more common now. That wasn't really seen as the norm then. So, have a shared space so that people don't have to run their own office, right? Everyone shares the fax machine or the phone, but it's also then a safe space for people to have organic conversations about what they're doing rather than people in sort of siloed areas. So there was one sort of donor who was involved with that. Well, unbeknownst to us, and some of the exact details I probably won't remember, but what I do remember is we gave money to invest in this house, and then the house got sold. And that wasn't discussed with everyone. It was kind of upsetting. And there was some sort of compensation. But, I think that's an example of where, you're sort of working communally, but then there are individual interests, right? And that individual interest of that one organization didn't match with what we thought we were doing collectively. But for the most part, I think it's really worthwhile for donors to come together. One, you can just leverage your resources a lot more. I think you can have a larger impact. And then I think I think people underestimate non-financial support. I think for organizations, like when we actually showed up on the ground, that we spent the time and the money to actually not just go to Harare, but fly up to Bulawayo, drive into the countryside, and sit with people who we didn't necessarily give any money to, but just say, we want to listen to what's happening so that we can tell other people, but we also just want you to know you're not alone. I think for a lot of people, that was really important to them to hear that. And so I think that's an easier thing to do collaboratively and together, and it's frankly much more rewarding than just doing on your own. I think being able to have a number of us around the table, voices who could then, in our own networks, go out and talk about the Zimbabwe Alliance. And, for some donors, different aspects of it were more important than other aspects of it. And so I think having those, different points of view and different ways of sort of amplifying the Zimbabwe Alliance raised the tide, for a lot more of the organizations and the issues at hand than necessarily one funder coming in with maybe the same amount of money. I think the impact was greater.
So it's interesting that you refer to that grant for the NGO house.
You probably remember the details better than I do.
Because it's
you can name names.
It's one of the grants. It's one of the grants that we use as a probably as a 101 grant making lesson. Because so there are several elements to it. I think first and foremost, when we did that grant, we knew nothing about construction. I'm talking about us now, where people on the ground implementing. I think we knew nothing about construction. We were so sold by the idea of an NGO house, which is actually what we have today as WeWork concept. It's like the new WeWork concept. So we were sold by that, and we just went in, I think, deep in it. So as we then started getting into the details, now money had already been paid, we started realizing that things were not making sense. So we asked, but where is the house? I mean, we could see the house, but where are the renovations? I remember this funny answer that we got from the project manager. He says, renovations were done underground.
There's tunnels, there's safe rooms.
So basically he was saying the grant is underground. So that then began to be a bit of an issue for us. But we used that grant because we then went to Akwasi now to try and resolve this as our boss. And Akwasi was so helpful in making us understand the art of grant making, what to get out of a failure and learn out of it. So
absolutely.
So we used that as a 101 lesson on grant making. But the same organization that was responsible for that building was also responsible for Book Cafe. And in Book Cafe, amazing work was actually happening around the art community.
I remember visiting there.
Yes, so there was the conversations there, some of them that were so critical to the country. The artists were coming together to do joint work, would bring people from Senegal and elsewhere. And then, if you remember, the tables at Book Cafe, they were laminated with newspaper articles. And these newspaper articles had all to do with political governance, human rights, and all of that. And that was part of the ZimAlliance support that made them to do all of that. So when people come to Book Cafe,
it's still there.
It's still there. I mean, I don't think Book Cafe is open now. But when people used to go there, one of the things that they would immediately leave with is just the information on the tables describing the state of the country at that particular moment in time. So that grant was fascinating because it had failure on it, but it also had this.
Failure's an interesting word to use because I do think, philanthropic capital is made to take risks, right? So if you don't actually have failures, and again, maybe a better word is it didn't turn out, the intentions weren't what happened. And sometimes there are outright failures, maybe money is not used, is pocketed or whatever it might be. But, I don't think you're doing your job as a foundation and as a donor if you don't come across occasionally things that, are considered a failure. Because you should be risking that capital. You should be trying things that haven't been tried before. You should be giving to fledgling organizations that might not make it. But it doesn't mean that the money shouldn't have been spent.
So this is a good segue for me because I wanted to talk to you about, being somebody who was involved in the beginning of ZimAlliance as a philanthropist yourself, but also as a technical person leading the foundation, and having stepped back from actual implementation for a while, but still involved as a trustee, but also maybe watching the space. I wanted to get a sense of what's your take on the role of philanthropy in today's current, existential issues that are facing the world globally, but also more importantly, maybe Africa and the context that you are familiar with?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, I personally rarely introduce myself as a philanthropist.
Yeah.
I think it's a very heavy word, it's a big word.
Yeah.
I think it has, a lot of implications about power dynamics. I personally rather identify as an activist,
Yeah.
right? Who happens to be really lucky to have a philanthropic organization, a foundation that I can use to advance sort of my values in the world.
Yeah.
So I do wish more philanthropists actually saw themselves as something else first, in a way, whether they're part of a community or whatever it is. I think if you're, someone once told me, you're smart to raise money, but you need wisdom to give away money, or something like that. And I don't think all of the philanthropic community is necessarily wise in how they give their money away. I think there's a lot of power dynamics. We were talking about this sort of new evolution of trust-based philanthropy and what does that mean. So for me, philanthropy, particularly as it affects the African continent, first of all, I think there just needs to be more of it. I think more money needs to be directed to Africa, and in the context of what's happening today in the world with climate change, back, when we started in 1998, our foundation, climate change wasn't sort of on the table the way it is now. And so certainly on the African continent, I think you're seeing a lot of the effects of climate change happening to poorer communities as opposed to the people who are doing the polluting and sort of causing the problems. So I do think there should be certainly way more resources directed across the globe to the countries that are being impacted by climate change. But then across that, you've mentioned social movements numerous times. I think a lot more philanthropy should be going towards the causes of our problems rather than the symptoms of our problems in the world. And I think philanthropy needs to do, or I think people in the philanthropic space have to think more politically. And in the United States, you have to be very careful because you can't give money to direct, races, elections, individuals. But there's a lot of money that I think people shy away from giving to the political space to actually change what's happening with governments.
Yeah.
I think a lot of the corruption that you see, particularly on the African continent, but globally, is actually coming from our governments, the people who are supposed to be leading and supporting their people. And so my hope would be that more philanthropic dollars, frankly, go to human rights, but also go to people changing how countries are governed.
Yeah.
And being a lot, I sometimes think philanthropy shies away from being seen as political or being seen as wanting to have a voice in those things. So I wish people didn't play it as safe in the philanthropic space. I wish people were more willing to speak out against what they see, put more resources into changing governments.
Yeah.
And then on sort of the flip side, not governments, but putting more money into smaller organizations, which from a logistics point of view is not easy. But to the organizations that are quite small, but are the ones that are deeply embedded in the communities. They are the community, right?
Yeah.
And so, one of the things that Schooner's always tried to do is fund through intermediaries. And I think intermediary is sort of a drab term. It doesn't really, I think, describe the agency and the effectiveness and the efficiency. So I'll just use an example because they did actually help support the Zimbabwe Alliance, is the Fund for Global Human Rights.
Yeah.
Plowshares Fund is another one that comes to mind, global green grants in terms of the economy, in terms of the environment. But these are organizations that, can sometimes give $500, can give directly to an individual who might need to, get out of DRC because their life is at risk.
Yeah.
Or can give a $20,000 startup grant to, a really effective new organization that's working, in Liberia. So you can give your money. You don't have to worry about all the different sort of complications of giving internationally, because a lot of global giving from the United States changed after 2011, with some of the anti-terrorism acts. And so it became harder to give internationally to individuals and things. So funding through intermediaries for Schooner has been significant. I mean, our probably cornerstone human rights grantee for probably well over 10 years was the Fund for Global Human Rights.
Yeah.
And so I think finding those organizations that can get the money to numerous small organizations around the world is a great way to sort of address that problem, but make sure that where the problems are, the solutions are as well. And not necessarily the easier things that are the big international organizations. And I'm not sort of bashing them, but the Human Rights Watch, Save the Children, Oxfam, they have enormous overhead. And so, a $5,000 grant to them is not going to be nearly as significant as to a Fund for Global Human Rights that might get it to a small women's organization in Tunisia that you've never even heard of, because they can also do the due diligence. The Schooner Foundation is one person basically, in terms of staff. So we can't do that kind of due diligence. So using organizations that intermediaries can actually make a huge difference in your capacity to do smart grant making.
So I mean, clearly you brought yourself, your values, and your probably even political agenda into the philanthropy space. And maybe for people who are not aware of what the Schooner Foundation is, maybe can you give us the history of what the Schooner Foundation is, what it stands for, why it was even established?
Sure. So Vin Ryan, my father, started a for-profit venture capital firm called Schooner Capital. Schooner's the three-masted ship, really beautiful ship. He liked the image, so nothing to do actually with any maritime. I remember people used to ask me if we only funded like maritime issues, and I was like, no, just an image he loved. Successful businessman, and I think was driven by wanting to make a difference. I mean, he's always been philanthropic and generous in terms of giving to his communities even before he had a foundation, but it made sense to actually create one not only for a tax reason, but also just to organize how he's giving. I was at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies, studying social anthropology of development, and was going to go to Tanzania and work. Ended up back in Boston, and he just sort of said, would you like to help me get this foundation started? I didn't know much about philanthropy. I knew of the Ford Foundation, Rockefeller, but it wasn't something I spent much time thinking about. So we sort of jumped in. We chose human rights, I think partly because there weren't a lot of donors doing it, but we felt like we could also have a really big impact doing it. And we were surprised at how little funding went into it. And so one of our early grantees was Landmine Survivors Network. And I traveled to Mozambique with Jerry White, who was an American who had actually stepped on a landmine in Israel. And so he had lost his leg to a landmine. And he created Landmine Survivors Network with a tagline, "Nothing about us without us." And I've never forgotten it. And this was back in 1999 that I think we went to Maputo for the there was a large meeting around the landmine treaty, which the U.S. has still never signed. And I just thought he's so right that a lot of philanthropy is talking about solutions for people without including them in the room. It's like, okay, so this doesn't really make sense. Why wouldn't we actually want to include the people who are affected or who live with this issue or who live in that place? And so that was a very early seed in how I wanted to approach philanthropy. And then I think, recognizing that unrestricted funding would have huge impact, not being, again, so burdensome in terms of reporting. We were talking about this earlier. It was almost doing trust-based philanthropy without naming it that. But understanding that the people doing the work, it's supporting them without dictating to them what they should be doing. The other thing I found over a number of years, so one of the benefits of being a donor and not necessarily working for one NGO is you sort of have an eagle-eye view, right? So you're seeing what lots of NGOs are doing. So you learn from observing best practices. So I was able to, sort of say to one organization, hey, you know what? We fund Women for Women International, and they've been doing this, and it's been really effective. So you could as someone who kind of saw a lot of what was happening, share those things with people. You could connect organizations to each other, because small NGOs doing human rights work are very much in the weeds, and sometimes they don't have the resources to kind of poke their heads up and go and meet other people, participate in conferences. So we were able to do all kinds of things that I think really helped organizations, besides reaching out to other donors on behalf, getting them on panels so that they could meet other people, just sharing what other organizations do, bringing people together. So inviting, maybe even just, having a number of leaders come to lunch. I mean, I can remember just when I lived in Washington, D.C. for 14 years, if Briggs was coming back into town, right, organize, an event. I remember hosting Wangari Maathai at my home, and it led to her getting another significant grant.
Yeah.
Donors tend to like to hang around other donors. So my having that access and that privilege, I could open that door and bring people in with me, which was really rewarding. So a lot of what we did was really just me trusting my instincts and living the values I had, and then seeing, frankly, how things didn't work and wanting to change them.
Yeah. So I want to connect that with what you said around, most donors at times shy away from funding spaces like that, like governance, funding initiatives that might also lead to addressing government failures and among others. One would have thought that once you have resources, it's almost automatic that you are able to have a voice and you are able to speak truth to power and put resources towards that. In fact, that's, I think, one of the notions and maybe misconceptions that people have, that philanthropists have got so much power to do even, what probably to them is a no-go area. But the general populace would actually think that because you have resources, you are able to fund anything. Most of philanthropies, especially at least as much as I know in Africa, the majority of high net worth individuals can easily convene our governments. Our governments can be convened by just one individual to actually come and discuss whatever issues there might be. So what is it that stops philanthropy from doing such activist philanthropy or activist interventions?
One, I think oftentimes for someone to have become so successful and a high net individual, at that point you don't necessarily want to rock the boat.
Yeah.
You've benefited from the inequity that's maybe already in place in the country where you live, or you've benefited from a privilege that you don't necessarily want to then take away from yourself or your family. So I do think by human nature, it's rare the individual that actually wants to maybe lessen the individual power and access that their family has to broaden it for everybody.
Yeah.
So, I think part of it is convincing individuals that they should look beyond just kind of their own success, what's going to benefit them, or benefit their immediate community, their immediate family, and actually want to benefit people who are struggling, who don't have the same access. And that's not something that everybody wants to do. In fact, I would say, a lot of people want to amass as much as they can for themselves.
Yeah. So as we end, I want to see quickly, I know if you can, do you have an extra mic? Are you able to mic Julia? And then you can turn the camera. You don't have to move, it's fine. We can do it from there. I've always been fascinated by this thing of, philanthropies that take on different shapes. So there are philanthropies and foundations whose founders are still alive.
Yes.
And this is the case with you and the foundation. And then there are philanthropies whose founders are no longer with us. And how the two at times operate. Obviously, the ones whose founders are still around, you would expect them to still have an active role in directing the maybe the intervention or the direction of the foundation. Whereas the ones that, like your Ford Foundations and others, there's no longer any relationship even with the family now. So there's clearly a board and all those things that do that kind of work. I just wanted to hear from your take, because you are still, you and your father, the family are still there running the foundation. What is the difference between this way of doing philanthropy and the way other foundations whose founders are no longer alive? Are there any differences that you can easily pick out?
I think so. I mean, I think when the donor's still alive, they obviously are the ones directing most of the giving, and also setting the tone, right, for in terms of values. And I've seen going to different family foundation meetings. The Council on Foundations in America has just a family foundation conference every year, and it's interesting because you will see, particularly by the third generation. So the children of the original donor obviously are usually very deeply connected to that parent or uncle or whatever it might be. So they really understand that person. They've lived with that person. They know firsthand what matters to them. Then by the time those people have their children and they might be trustees and part of the foundation, they could have very different political views, very different upbringings. And so you can sometimes start to see tension in that. And sometimes foundations split up. I think there's been a number of family foundations where you end up having, Wallace Global Fund would be an example. I think there's the Wallace Global Fund, and then, another son broke off and started his own foundation. Warren Buffett's children each have their own individual foundation. So I think that's very common. I think once a family member isn't directly involved, or for example, the Ford Foundation, then I think, you really want to make sure you have a strong board. But also even Ford, I mean, look how much Darren Walker, who's stepping down now, was able to do for Ford. I mean, I think he'll go down as one of the most dynamic leaders. So I wouldn't ever say it doesn't matter who's at the helm of a foundation, because it does. Because they can really push their board, and then they can also have a very outward-facing voice. I mean, Darren's been so out in the world talking about what matters, and you can tell it matters to him as well as it matters to Ford. But I think he's changed Ford in a way. So who runs a foundation really makes a difference. And just from the Schooner Foundation point of view, so I ran the foundation for the first 14 years. And worked obviously very closely with my father, but I was the person sort of going out and doing a lot of the work. When I moved to Kenya, and as we were growing as a foundation and giving away more assets, Julia, who we're going to be talking to shortly, came in as an executive director, and I have to give her enormous props for professionalizing what we were doing, and also frankly having someone who's not a family member running the organization can take a lot of the family dynamics and stress and tension out of it, because she's objective as opposed to necessarily being seen as more aligned with one sibling or more aligned with this. So I think it's been an enormous benefit to Schooner, as much as I miss actually running the foundation in a lot of ways. Not because I was paid that well, but because I just loved it.
The passion and
I
everything.
actually think Schooner is more effective in a lot of ways now because it's not a family member running it. And I would actually, we're having a family foundation meeting in December, and we're going to be talking about perhaps starting to bring in non-family members. So I think bringing in experts and objective voices and people with different experiences than just those family members is hugely important to family foundations, personally.
So I didn't plan this because I actually thought this is a useful moment for African philanthropies and African families that want to set up family foundations, because there's no formula, there's no template, and I think what you've just said now is so important about the need to professionalize practice, and at times you need to do that by getting somebody specialized, somebody from outside the family. So I want to introduce Julia, who is the executive director of the Schooner Foundation. Julia, when we were coming here, one of the things that you were saying was that you were so excited about the alignment between your values and the values of the Schooner Foundation. And I think that's something that Cynthia is also relating to, that, you know, who runs the foundation is actually very important. There might be a family, but if your values and the values of the foundation are not aligned, then already you have a disaster to start with. Maybe let's just start just by hearing from yourself, you know, what are those values that drew you to actually working with the foundation? And so far, and I think we've said you've been with the foundation for, is it 6 years now? Yes. In the 6 years, what has been your experience so far?
Sure. So I come from the nonprofit sector. I've worked in every area of nonprofits, from programs to fundraising to nonprofit leadership. And Schooner was actually a funder of mine when I was in the nonprofit space. So I would say that one of the things that was really important was that there was already trust and relationship there when I was asked to come and join Schooner. And it was quite overwhelming because I actually didn't, except from having been on the side of the table of fundraising, I didn't really know the space very well at all. And I remember thinking, when I was asked to come and to come and be part of Schooner, I remember thinking, well, if I don't take this opportunity, I think I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But it's a job I'm most likely to be fired from, because I don't really have that. I don't know if I would have applied for this, you know, in terms of I don't really know the sector. But what I knew was that our values were so aligned. I knew from personal experience, whether it was upbringing and working in the nonprofit space, that it was exactly what Cynthia talked about, community-based solutions, you know, funding people most proximate to the issues, looking at not just looking at what are the root causes of issues, flexible funding, long-term support, walking in accompaniment with our partners, going beyond financial support, taking risks, you know, and I loved that we could be as, you know, strategic as it makes sense, you know, because I also think we have to always really be agile and willing to pivot, but you could also be really responsive, and I loved that. I loved that sometimes there would be an opportunity to step in when nobody else could, and it was a phone call, you know, talking to Cynthia or talking to Vin, and it could just be like, let's do it, you know. And so, you know, I've been asked many times, you know, would you work for another family foundation? And I always say, I don't know, it depends. It depends if we really have this alignment. And I do think that I was the first non-family member to come in. And I just want to say that there were a couple of things I learned. You know, I came in having led a nonprofit. So immediately I was like, okay, I think I know what leadership looks like. And I wrote up a job description, and it was all about developing strategy and this and that. And I would say to anyone stepping into a family foundation, listen deeply, get to know the family. Don't think you're coming in with some big plan. I've seen people in my role go in, big plans, and a year and a half later or 2 years later, they're no longer working for the family foundation because they didn't take the time to really understand what's the history, what was the strategy. It was all there. It just maybe hadn't been, you know, fully documented, but it was a beautiful journey of, look at this incredible foundation and let's understand, you know, what the first 20 years looked like and what we can do together. So I would say to anyone in my role, take your time to listen, you know, work closely with the families, take time to really understand the shared values. And I would also say, don't ever lose the joy and constant learning. So, yeah.
Yeah, and then of course, being the current director now, what is the Schooner Foundation doing? Where do we see it in the next 5 to 10 years? What are the key issues that keep you awake today?
Yeah, so I think that, well, first of all, we're very broad, and I actually really like that because it gives us a lot of flexibility. So we take a human rights lens, and just in terms of giving a sense of what we're doing, I would say, again, every organization is at the intersection of all the various issues, so these pillars seem, you know, but it's how we organize the portfolio. But we're doing about a third of the portfolio in social justice and human rights, and then we're doing global health equity, and then education, livelihoods, environment. I think that this year we'll grant 125 organizations, and really ranging all the way from very grassroots to policy level and everything in between. Research, growth stage organizations, intermediaries, and I always say it's broad. I've never been more of a generalist, which I think is good because you shouldn't feel that you're the expert. What keeps me up at night, the issues feel big. You know, I think that when I look at just crisis, disaster, war, we have incredible partners, and I just think that you're working along a plan and then war breaks out, and all of a sudden I think the magnitude of what we're dealing with keeps me up at night, feeling like what we can do is enough. I think what also keeps me up at night is opportunity, because I think when you get to the place where you no longer think you have the answers, you're the most open. So I would say that some of the ways that I feel like we've sort of expanded our lenses, I would say, in the last years. We're thinking a lot more about mental health, for example. We've always had a focus on mental health, but now we're sort of realizing that whether you're working in health or education or livelihoods or climate, you have to take a mental health lens, you have to take a trauma lens. I think there's been a lot of learning, and I do want to say this because this was an incredible learning journey. What I love about Schooner is, yes, we've put in place a strategy, we have priorities, we're constantly iterating. I think if you're not looking at your strategic goals every few months, your plan isn't alive enough. So I think we have that. We do multi-year partnerships. We sort of have where we want to distribute in general. But I love that we're also responsive in times of crisis and disaster. And we spent a lot of time as a foundation in the last few years thinking about how are you responsive? And what was happening initially is we were sort of seeing something we wanted to be responsive to. And then we thought, we were looking at organizations we could partner with. But what we actually learned over the last couple of years, which has really been sort of instrumental in our grant making, is find partners you're already working with, and when something happens, work with them and get that funding. Get that funding out as quickly as possible, 24 hours, because that flexible funding early on in a crisis until the larger funding comes in is absolutely critical. After the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, we sent funding within 18 hours, and it was used to get the lamps, for the white helmets to be able to, get into the rubble and put fuel in the ambulances. And so I think I would say that, yes, the issues, and I'd love Cynthia to speak to this as well, the issues for me, they feel really big, they feel overwhelming, but I think there's both that heaviness and also this, yes, there's opportunity, we cannot afford to despair, and let's do it with amazing people, like-minded colleagues, funders, partners, and let's really shift, let's do something in our generation for the younger generation to shift things.
I would really love at some point to do a full episode with you, because when we were talking earlier, I was so intrigued by what you were saying about where you came from and some of the experiences that you have gone through to the point where you are now leading the foundation. And I would be keen to know, maybe as the last question, how you have brought that experience into the position that you currently hold at the foundation.
Yeah, so my parents worked for GTZ, which is now GIZ. I was born in Germany, and so I would say where life is. At the age of 3, we moved to rural Zambia on the Angolan border in a district called Kabompo, 10 hours from Lusaka. And I, almost to the age of 10, we lived in the village. I always say rural, and then moved to Zimbabwe in different contexts. But what I'll say is what I did witness is development initiatives that don't work. Might be best of intentions, a lot of money, technical expertise, a lot of expats, But what you saw, what I knew already as a child, being in the having my friends in the village and spending time with the communities was you would look, for example, at goats and say those are project goats and those are not project goats. Or when you were actually living it as a child, you experienced it very differently. I always had so I know we spoke about this briefly, but I think that the biggest gift, there's sort of three things I'd point to. One is the biggest gift I had of growing those early years was not feeling a sense of otherness, you know, and I think that informs everything about me today, or I'd hope it would. I don't go into context and feel like, you know, I'm superior coming from this point of view. I know that every woman, wherever she is a mother, is an entrepreneur. We all have far more we have in common than we don't. I worked in the nonprofit sector, and then I really had to figure out what is my role, where can I serve? And I ended up landing on strategic partnerships and really trying to drive resources to great nonprofits. And I would just say what informs my work is what I thought was when I came into the philanthropic space, I was concerned I didn't have philanthropic experience. I was like, I was like, I'm an NGO person. And I've come to really, really value that, because until you've been in the seat of a nonprofit asking for the funding, until you've been grappling with a proposal when you don't even know what the donor might be looking for, when you don't have clarity, because most private philanthropies, you have no idea, what are they looking for, what size of grant, I don't know. You know, so I think that, and I know that that's what Schooner valued about me, even though it probably took me quite a while to figure it out.
Yeah,
and in fact, Julia was part of an organization that, if we were going to use the term failure, was a failed grant. And we visited together, and actually with Vin, which was very unusual because he doesn't come and do site visits very often, but he went to Kenya he's on the board of the Nature Conservancy, so we went to Uganda and did a number of visits, and Julia joined us. And that's really where I, realized we were going to have somebody new running, if we were going to have someone new running the foundation. In fact, there was no one on my short list but her. But that was, a very difficult visit because we were realizing we would not be giving this individual money again. And she was so good at understanding that and articulating it. But it was just sort of funny that ended up being our connection, is through a grant that we actually stopped giving. And then I would just, I guess I would make a plug for people to try to do more human rights funding, because one, you do see sort of the worst of humankind, right? You see the atrocities, you learn about awful things. Women for Women International was one of our grantees, and I visited Congo with them, Bosnia, and you hear really the most horrible stories you can imagine. But it's the flip side that's so inspiring, right? Because then you also see the enormous resilience of people and the enormous capacity of people to survive things. Landmine Survivors Network would also say, we're not just surviving, we're thriving. And you would actually see that for yourself. So it's intensely rewarding to be able to see a community and see individuals that have suffered so much and then extraordinarily rebuild their lives. There's nothing really more rewarding than that. And then, I talked about intermediary grant making. I would say the other thing that we've been able to do at Schooner is identify individuals who have extraordinary ideas and leadership capacity, and maybe incredibly eloquent communicators, but they don't maybe have the resources to grow their organization. And so, I could name, one of the reasons we did Zimbabwe Alliance was Briggs and Kumi and Akwasi. Those, we didn't go in saying, we just want to fund in Zimbabwe, let's find an organization. It was, meeting Briggs, understanding what was happening on the ground. But Jerry White was another one. I met him. In fact, actually, he met my father first, and he was so compelling in his story that we decided to fund the landmine issue. Zainab Salbi, Women for Women International, she grew up in Iraq. She got stuck in the United States during, the war. And she started Women for Women with money that was given for her honeymoon with her husband. And they went and actually visited women in 1994 who were in the Bosnian rape camps. Another one would be Van Jones, who's done a lot of really dynamic work in the United States. We funded some of the work that we did around what he did, criminal justice, because he was so dynamic.
Yeah,
So I think it's also being really open to meeting individuals who with or without your support, are going to do extraordinary things, but why not elevate them and give them more of a voice and more resources to do what they want?
Yeah.
So I've been incredibly proud of the cohorts of Paul Farmer. How can we not mention Paul Farmer, right? Yeah. We started funding Paul Farmer, I think, before a lot of people knew how extraordinary he was. So I think having that ability to identify individuals who are doing amazing things and working alongside them is not only a privilege, but it's just, a way to do your philanthropy that just takes you down roads you didn't expect to go down, which, again, having a human rights sort of lens allows you to do that. And so, not only do you make extraordinary friends and colleagues, but you just get to be part of, someone's journey who's changing the world for the better.
Yeah. I mean, other than the values, Julia, I also see that it's also important to get into a family where you all immediately have some chemistry. I can tell that there's some chemistry between you and Cynthia, and that helps actually in running the foundation on their behalf. Because if there was no chemistry, chances are you would just be stuck on professional, technical roles, and without this interconnection, which is really one of the most important things, the interpersonal trust. I think, for me, I've always found that to be the most useful thing in leadership, in fundraising, in everything that I do. I always find that the interpersonal trust is one of the most important things, and I'm picking that between the two of you.
And I think Julia is able to be a safe space for the other trustees, right? So when I was running it, maybe my sisters and my brother didn't always feel as comfortable coming and saying, well, I'd really like to do something else, or what do you think? So she's like a very safe sounding board for people who might, we're not all completely aligned within my family to want to fund things. One example is I have a sister who would love to give to rescue centers for dogs. That's not something my father's interested in, right? And it doesn't mean she's been able to do it, but she can sort of talk to Julia and work that stuff out. She also can play the role of sort of mediator. I think there's very significant roles she plays that a family member can't play. That, from a professional point of view, but also personal family dynamics. Families don't exist without tension. So, I give her props for, balancing that, because it is a juggling act.
Yeah.
So I think also one of the things that makes the Schooner Foundation interesting as a family office is that, the money that Schooner Capital, the for-profit company that my father's had for over 50 years, the partners in his Schooner Capital, the for-profit wing, not only do they manage the assets of the foundation, but they also contribute profits from the for-profit company into the foundation. So the foundation's actually able to continue to grow its assets. And then very uniquely, I think, is that the partners of the for-profit know what the foundation's doing. They are interested. One of the head partners of Schooner Capital sits on the board of the Schooner Foundation, the only non-family member. And they actually communicate with the companies that they invest in about the foundation, that the money so if the company does well, Schooner Capital does well, the foundation does well, our grantees get more money. So it's a really interesting, I think, virtuous circle that very few people or very few family offices do. We celebrated Schooner Foundation at 20 years. We shared with them that beautiful document that you did. And so I think it's a really unique way to tie in a for-profit, how you've made the money, to really share those values across not just the foundation aspect of it, but with people who otherwise would really know nothing about the foundation. And I know you've gotten feedback, Julia, from not only the partners at Schooner, but also have heard about what some of the investment partners have felt about the foundation, if you want to talk about that.
Sure. So one of the things, going back to the first question that Becky had talked about, was values. And I think that one of the first things I would just say is that there's such alignment in values between the foundation and the capital side. And in terms of the impact on the portfolio partners, I recently heard a wonderful story where it was shared that a wonderful organization that they were investing in really emphasized how important the foundation was and them going into partnership with Schooner, and we're seeing a lot of that that happen. And I will say that in addition, in terms of how the foundation and the capital team actually all work in one office, and there's just beautiful conversations that come out of that. They will sometimes actually find a wonderful investment and bring it to the foundation, and we'll look at it together, or I'll bring them in for some advice if we're struggling with something, or if one of our partners could use some insights. So it's actually this really wonderful team effort. And actually what's really beautiful to see is that even some of their practices are very aligned with the Schooner Foundation's practices. They also really invest in people. They really focus on being good partners and going also beyond financial support. They sit on boards of their portfolio companies. They take a long-term view. They look at where's the greatest need and opportunity, where's, that might not be, they're sector agnostic, they're very broad. And so it's been actually really beautiful to see the values just reflected both ways. And there just seems to be more and more collaboration, and it's, I think it makes us really unique.
And I think for Vin, I refer to my dad as Vin, but I think for Vin and his personal legacy, he's extraordinarily proud of the for-profit business. It's enabled him to start the Schooner Foundation. But even when he's not here, Schooner Foundation and Schooner Capital will continue to do the work, because of course Schooner Capital does extremely well. We'll continue to channel resources into the foundation, have members of his executive team on the foundation board. So I think for me as his daughter and someone who's involved with the foundation, that connection is really going to carry on my father's legacy way beyond when he's here to sort of guide us. So I think for him that's personally satisfying, but also for his family it gives us a lot of, not only a source of pride, but an understanding that this foundation will be around for his 7 grandchildren to be part of, and their children and their children, which is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think what we have is a shared shared vision that we're all working towards, and shared values.
I mean, for me, this has been one of the most important conversations, just this segment, because we have never had a situation where we speak to the founding director, but also part of the family foundation, and the person who is actually running it. That has never happened, and I'm hoping at some point we can have those conversations, even in the African context, where we have lots of family foundations, but whose foundations are run by people from outside, just to have this conversation about what's coming from the family, but also what's coming from the professional person who is leading it. So with that, Julia, I want to thank you so much, but at some point we would really want to come and have a full episode with you, especially listening to Cynthia and some of these successes. I'm wondering whether there's something written down already, or this is something that we could think about.
I don't think so. It's a case study waiting
That's
to
what
be
I'm
written.
saying, yeah.
It's a case study.
It's a case study, yeah.
And we could come teach a 2-day class. We'd love to together.
We should come and we
Yeah.
would love to come back in person and do
yeah,
it, and
yeah.
maybe teach a class. And we have, even there's so much to share, even just our strategic planning journey, and how some things that you think how you're going to approach it, and then you're like, oh, we have to kind of do this a whole different way. But I think that I will say, every one of the trustees is just extraordinary in their own right. I think sometimes it's challenging operating as a body, perhaps, but it has been such a privilege and joy working with each family member on different things that they're passionate about, and figuring out how we do this. And I think that when there is, going back to your first question around values, when you share values, you can always go back to values. I mean, when a day is hard, you can just put up pictures of the people you work with, and you can remember, okay, we actually are all values aligned. It might be a little bit tough right now working through some of the technicalities, but I think that, it is. And I would also say, please let it never also stop being fun and joy, if you lose any kind of joy in the philanthropy of working with partners, even I think there's probably, especially because it is so hard, the spaces, I think that those connections are so deep and you make such deep relationships, and so thank you for having us. We would love to come back.
Great, thank you so much. So definitely there are certain areas where we are going to do follow-ups. One is on the case study and the involvement of our students, whether it's them writing, thinking about some of the issues that you work on, linking them with some of the partners that you might have in case they want to study that, but also internships, as we mentioned, just to think about internships for students, but also teaching. Definitely teaching. You can come as guest lecturers. We can also have a consistent way in which you can come into different modules, especially this issue of family foundations, how they are led, how they are governed, how they make strategies, how they give, where they give to. That would be something that would be fascinating to our students. But I also see another opportunity which we will probably solidify out of this conversation, which is that in our annual philanthropy conference, where we bring so many partners, between 300 and 500 people, I see a value of workshops that you could run, Julia, on something like this, especially for family foundations in an African setting. Like we could set up like a workshop of some sort on how to help them with leadership, with governance, with strategy doing, and etc. I think that's something that we could explore and see as a contribution to the sector as well. Like you said, the foundation does not just give money only. There are other ways in which you also do that. So this technical capacity building element within the family foundations might be something that we look at as well.
Yeah, I would say from both of us, yes, on all of the ideas that you have. I think that there's a lot of opportunity. And it's always actually been, there's centers and schools in the US that are doing it, but it's always felt for me, also because I studied at UCT, it's always felt like it should be coming from here. So to be able to partner with you, Cynthia and I both feel really strongly about, if we're going to make a contribution, please let it be from here,
Thank you so much, Julia. And Cynthia, it was so great seeing you again.
I know.
But also just reconnecting and talking about the ZimAlliance story. I don't think we really captured everything, but as I go around talking to various groups, I'm hoping that some kind of a solid story will come out of it, where we can even talk about some of the impact, because you and I have not even gotten to the level of impact. We have spoken about issues around maybe results and some of the successes, but I know that there's a lot of impact stories that have come out of it that I'm likely to pull out of the different conversations. So thank you so much for gracing us with your presence. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to the CAPSI podcast series, Conversations on African Philanthropy.